In his first public address, he talks about how we want to be a synodal church, a church that moves forward, a church that always seeks peace, that always seeks clarity, that always seeks to be close above all to those who are suffering. That doesn't make him boring, but there's kind of like nothing new there. And you know what? I'm here for it. Welcome to the Father Leo Show, where I am dishing out faith, culture, and commentary. And in this episode, we are going to review Pope Leo's first 100 days of his pontificate and determine whether or not he is good for the church, if he's bad for the church, or if he's just a boring pope. But before we jump into it, please make sure you like, subscribe, share, and comment. Let us know what your thoughts are, because it's the only way to overcome the algorithms that suppress good Catholic content. And as always, we can do shows like this with your support. So please go to patreon.com/thefatherleo show. You can support us at any level. And when you do that monthly, you actually get access to some great content and some special perks. So let's just jump right into it now, and let's review Pope Leo's 100-day scorecard and determine whether or not he is, in fact, boring. Let's figure that out. This idea of the boring pope was first brought to my attention prior to the conclave. You see, I was in Rome with 100 pilgrims for Pope Francis's funeral, which was originally scheduled to be the celebration for the canonization of Blessed Carlo Acutis. However, when we were there, it was the funeral and things just changed, and it was far from boring. But I remember meeting a priest friend of mine with whom I studied at the North American College in Rome. And he was friends with someone who worked in one of the dicasteries in the Vatican. And when we say dicastery, I know we kind of throw words like that around. It just basically means a type of a department. So this priest friend of mine is friends with some department worker priest in the Vatican. Anyway, as we were talking, we were discussing who could be the next pope for the Universal Holy Roman Catholic Church. And he said to me something that stuck with me. He said, "I don't really care who it is or what country he's from. I just want to have a boring pope right now." And that was such an interesting thing, because after Pope Leo XIV was elected, some good friends of mine who are hosts of the Catholic Talk Show did an episode called "Is Pope Leo a Boring Pope?" So I'm going to figure this out, because I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I think that this is the best time for me to do an episode about it, because he was elected on May the 8th. So if you take 100 days from May the 8th, his first 100 days would end on August the 16th, the day after the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So now we can actually evaluate 100 days of this very unique papal election leading up to the first American-born pope, first Augustinian religious order pope, and also what some people consider a boring pope. But that's not an insult. It's actually a compliment. But let's just first of all dissect boring. I'm going to give you a definition of boring, because some people actually think that the church is boring or that a homily is boring. So I'd like to give you a definition of boring. Boring can be defined as answering a question that no one is asking. So answering a question that no one is asking. So if I'm going to talk about stuff that nobody cares about, then guess what? I will be, in fact, boring. That's just all there is to it. But what's interesting about Pope Leo is that he's talking about the stuff that Catholics are asking. Catholics are asking for clarification of faith. And all this Pope has done was just simply talk about the faith. He has not waded into or made comments that were kind of off the cuff, creating firestorms amongst journalists many of whom have agendas definitely skewing left, and giving them an opportunity to either misrepresent or misinterpret Pope Francis's words. Okay, so what's interesting is that Pope Francis was just so beloved by popular media and by, for lack of a better term, worldly people, people of the world, people who didn't really care about what the Catholic Church taught, but cared about what the Catholic Church thinks regarding all of these controversial hot topics, making him such a not boring pope. So let's just kind of break this down. Why do even people care about what the Pope thinks? Well, because according to canon law, the Pope possesses supreme, full, immediate, and universal ordinary power in the church, which means not extraordinary, but that ordinary is basically nobody else has it. It belongs to him, which he is always able to exercise freely. Now, this is what makes Protestants go completely berserk. This is one reason why Greek Orthodox distance themselves from the Catholic Church, because they don't want any one person to have this type of authority. But what's different, say, between Protestants and even Orthodox, whether it be Greek, whether it be Syrian, whether it be Russian Orthodox, whether it be Ukrainian Orthodox, is that they're not actually not as united. There is only one church that is united, and that is the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and the Pope is elected amongst all of his cardinal peers, bringing him to the loggia, the balcony of St. Peter, after the election is complete. So for the Greek Orthodox, they will never have that. They can maybe elect a patriarch from amongst only Greek Orthodox leaders. Russians can elect a Russian Orthodox leader for the people in Russia. But there is therefore no one patriarch who can kind of manage the universal church in the world, because their powers, in a sense, are limited to Russia, to Ukraine, to, Serbia, or to, Greece. Doesn't make it bad. It just doesn't make it universal. And that's why Catholic is considered universal. In the Greek understanding, Katholikos means a fullness of spirit, which is a power given to the Pope because he has to be the Bishop of Rome, the center of the world. Well, center of the world in terms of like the ecclesiastical world. Anyway, let's get back to boring. Because if we were to say, take a look at the first 100 days of Pope Francis, if we were to take a look at Pope Francis, he was elected on March the 13th, 2013. I remember that day very clearly. I was just finishing up a meeting with my spiritual director, and as we came down to the main lobby, we saw people kind of rushing to the TV to figure out who the next pope is, because white smoke was emitted from the Sistine Chapel chimney. Exciting for everybody, especially following the resignation of an incredibly strange, tumultuous, not even tumultuous in a negative way, but the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, which sent shockwaves to the world, making the church no longer boring, but everyone rushed. On March the 13th, Pope Francis comes out onto the balcony, and he's not wearing the mozzetta, which is the red shoulder cape that is oftentimes used by the Pope, especially upon election. He's just wearing the white cassock. And he gives a very impromptu speech, very touching, very, how shall I say, very Francis-y, where he kind of bows down, asks for people to pray for them, a moment of silence, a real act of humility. His style is very Argentinian indeed. Anyway, the next day, the Pope makes his way to St. Mary Major to pray before the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Solus Populi Romani, excuse me, getting my languages, my vowels mixed up, but that's in St. Mary Major Church. And it's there that he is just greeting a ton of people, and he is shaking hands and kissing babies, and it was just kind of like a surprise visit. That gets people very, very excited. On March 16th, this is just again now 3 days after his pontificate, he meets with journalists and has an informal, impromptu style dialogue with them. And it just charms the heck out of all of these journalists because he comes across as so not Benedict. Benedict was a very cultured and academic, soft-spoken, and perhaps even, I'd say, shy introvert of a man. That's just all there is to it. That's who Benedict was. And so if we were to take a look at Pope Benedict, he would be considered by like the media to be a very boring pope. And why? Because Pope Benedict talked about things of the Catholic faith. And so they didn't want to give him any attention because he was just talking about the doctrines of the Catholic faith. Pope Francis wades into a ton of other topics. So for example, on March 19th, he has an informal open air kind of discussion. He's meeting people, he's kind of shaking hands and blessing people. But then he makes comments regarding the idolatry of money, the tyranny of capitalism, an outcry against global poverty, and he seems to be very negative on tradition. He also makes a comment after visiting Lampedusa in Italy, where it's kind of his first extra Vatican territorial visit, Lampedusa in Italy. On the plane ride, he is asked about gay marriage or gay people or homosexuality, and that's where we come up, and this is in his first week, first 10 days, where he says, "Who am I to judge?" And that gets everybody going. So this is not to throw any negativity on the late beloved Pope Francis, and may his soul rest in peace, because I personally really appreciated a lot of what he did. However, he did it in a way that got people talking. He would say things that were not 100% clear. I think probably the most unboring thing that he did was produce the document Fiducia Supplicans, which talked about the blessing of two people who are in an irregular matrimonial or civil union / marriage situation. Now that could have applied to heterosexuals who were not in a sacramental marriage, but it also applied to two people of the same sex who were in a civil union. This kind of gave permission to bless them, not the sacrament or the union itself, but to bless the two people individually. And why is this key? Because this is the stuff that the world is talking about. The world wants to hear what the supreme authority of the Catholic Church has to say. Contrasting that to, say, Pope Leo. You see, in his first 10 days, Pope Francis just said stuff and did stuff that, gosh, honestly, it got the media spinning. He was on the news so much, probably the reason why he had an over 80% approval rating from the world. And Pope Leo the 14th, who is named after Pope Leo the 13th, this is critical, didn't do any of that stuff. He just didn't do any of that stuff. But that doesn't make him boring, at least for Catholics, because Catholics are not asking about a ton of social controversial issues. At the heart, I think Catholics just want to make sure they understand what it means to be a faithful, obedient follower of Jesus Christ. And yeah, some of these other issues are going to come out, but honestly, the way we see things and the way the world see things, it's like night and day. And certainly we want to bring a little bit of light to the darkness that the world is enveloped in, but we have to make sure we understand the faith. And so this Pope could have just issued a slew of canonical equivalents of an executive order, say as President Trump did in his first 100 days. And by the way, every president does that upon their election and inauguration, being sworn into the office. And he could have just started changing a whole bunch of department heads around, but he didn't. Pope Leo actually confirmed the heads of the Curia offices on a temporary basis. A few days after his election, he just basically said, everybody who is the head of an office right now, you are still going to remain there for a temporary basis. Later on, we can reevaluate. So he didn't rush into things. We can predict that maybe later in this year, in the fall, we're going to see some changes made. But he didn't make any changes in all of that stuff. And so if we were to take a look at what Pope Leo did do, we would see that he is far, however, from boring. Because if we were to take a look at Pope Leo, first of all, he is named after Pope Leo XIII, who was a revolutionary pope, but in a good way revolutionary pope. He was the one who gave us the St. Michael the Archangel prayer. He's also the Pope who wrote the groundbreaking encyclical Rerum Novarum, which talks about the dignity of workers. He condemns the heresy of Americanism and encouraged people to see their work not only as a vocation, but as a way to respond to people just becoming very blasé about their Catholic faith. So he was very popular. I mean, even to the point where my mother named me after him. I'm not named after Pope Leo the Great, the first Leo. My mom said I wasn't great at anything, so anyway, that's another story. But, Pope Leo XIII was very big in promoting the rosary. And this is key, because if we don't understand Leo XIII, we're not going to understand why Leo XIV picked that name. And he was also someone who understood science to the point where he founded the Vatican Observatory. And he wanted to make sure that the church does not stand against true science, but embraces it and promotes it, knowing that in his time there was many revolutions, a very big American revolutions with technology, science, modernity. A lot was going on. And guess what? Pope Leo, elected May 8th, 2025, chose that name because he recognized we are in the midst of another revolution with AI, with this understanding of people experiencing tremendous confusion with their genders. This is a big deal. And so his perceived style is that he's a very quiet man. Pope Francis walked out, spoke off the cuff. Pope Leo walked out, and this is why people might think he's boring. But here's why I love the man. Not just because of his name. Okay, I get it. But he walked out and there was a piece of paper in a folder because he took the time to write out his address to the people of God. And the first words that he said was, "Peace be with all of you." That was his first set of words. That's stemming from his Augustinian background. He is not uneducated to the ways of the world. He was born in America, spent much of his time in Peru as a bishop, but also a missionary, but also spent a lot of time in the dicastery for the bishops in the Vatican. So he knows how first world works. He knows how third world, developing nation works. And he also knows how ecclesiastical authority in the Vatican works. This is a huge advantage for this particular pope. Now, granted, he wants to have meaningful conversations, communication, and he even used the term synodal. But that is not a bad term at all. It just basically means that we're able to kind of come together and talk about the things that matter the most. And while he, conservative Catholics might complain that he is somehow continuing the very progressive actions of Pope Francis, there's actually no indication that he's done that at all. There's been more than anything what I would call a focus on decency. So, in his first public address, he talks about how we want to be a synodal church, a church that moves forward, a church that always seeks peace, that always seeks clarity, that always seeks to be close above all to those who are suffering. That doesn't make him boring, but there's kind of like nothing new there. And you know what? I'm here for it. That's a good thing. When we look at Pope Leo, he continues with some of the fundamental points of Pope Francis's exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, which was fine. That's fine. But he actually went to the cardinals after he was elected and said that he wanted to highlight 6 points from Pope Francis and continue this. And ready for this? The return to the primacy of Christ in proclamation, making sure Christ is the center. The missionary conversion of the entire Christian community. In other words, people who are already Catholic, we need to see ourselves as missionary, but we need to also experience our own conversion. Growth in collegiality and synodality. That's perfectly fine. It means they all have to work together. He's not going to take his papacy and kind of make these new proclamations and kind of shove it down people's throats, which is what, in a sense, people accused Pope Francis of doing. Now, did he do it? No, I don't think he did. Not to the extent that he's criticized of, but he did make some off-the-cuff proclamations that felt like he was imposing things on the church without actually using his dogmatic powers, his powers of infallibility. Anyway, let's continue this. He wants to focus on the attention to the sensus fidei, sensus fidelium, the faith of the people of God, especially in its most authentic and inclusive forms, such as popular piety, loving care for the least and the rejected. And then also to make sure that we have a trusting dialogue with the contemporary world in all of its components and realities. So, when I say it like that, it kind of sounds boring because people just might not care about those things. They want the Pope to weigh in on gay marriage, transgenderism, the economy. They want to wage war on wage words on the wars. And it's interesting because the Pope does these things, but he does it in a very calculated, measured fashion. He's not doing it to stir up attention to his opinions, but he directs everything focusing on Christ. So he can't be that boring because according to a Gallup poll in the United States that was published in the early part of August, Pope Leo was seen as the most favorable viewed of 14 world leaders and major newsmakers. So we're probably thinking like influencers, presidents, political people, artists, athletes. Well, the Pope was seen as the most favorable. Go figure. Anyway, if we were to take a look at Pope Francis versus, say, Pope Benedict and now Pope Leo, I'm going to let you know what people are saying in terms of how they view each individual. Pope Francis leads by 80% favorability. Pope Benedict was 67% favorability. Pope Leo is kind of right in the middle. He's 76% favorability. So as some people saw Pope Benedict as very boring, especially compared to Pope St. John Paul II as hardly boring, then we have, okay, so here's St. John Paul II, very high favorability, in the news a lot, did things. He was, in a way, very engaged in worldly things, but did it with such grace and dignity. Pope Benedict was very, how would I say, academic, more introverted, but he said some amazing things, but just no one paid attention to him necessarily because all they were going to get from him was Catholic Church teaching. That was it, Catholic Church teaching. Then, with his surprise resignation, then you have Pope Francis, who was seen very favorably because he's now starting to talk in very, how shall I say, very human, non-ecclesiastical ways. But he was just out there all the time. He was basically making news. Pope Leo, not so much. But people just realize that for the Jubilee of Hope, to celebrate young people and influencers, he drew over 1 million people to a part of Italy. And they came from all around the world, and he wowed them because he speaks not only Italian, but he also speaks Spanish. And guess what? He also speaks American. He also speaks English. And you got to know that if you want to reach people, you have to be able to speak their language. And he does, knowing that the majority of people in the world speak English. There are more people that speak English than speak Italian. I can tell you that for sure. And there's a lot of people that speak Spanish, but more people in Spanish also speak English, for sure. So I offer all of these thoughts to you, not because I want this title of boring pope to be something that sticks, because it would be unfair. Now, I know some people are saying it in a complimentary way because they're comparing him to Francis, but you shouldn't do that because then we get into this game of determining, I like this pope more than that pope, and I'm going to listen to this pope and not that pope. That's just terrible, because every one of these papacies have given us an experience of the voice of Christ speaking through their personhood, their personality, their way of speaking. But I can say that a lot of people appreciate that this particular pope is approaching his papacy with the Augustinian mentality, to create peace, to do more listening than speaking, and making sure that the words that come out of his mouth are just as eloquent and prepared as St. Augustine's beautiful book, The Confessions. And I am here for it. Let me know what your thoughts are about this pope. Do you think that he's boring, but in a good way? But I actually think he's quite exciting. He has said many beautiful things that are more meditative than controversial. And again, that's what I'm looking for from a pope, which means he is hardly boring. And, as I said before, I kind of like his name. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and this excursion of the first 100 days of the Pope. May he experience God's blessing and peace. And let us know your thoughts, because your engagement helps us to overcome the algorithms of the internet. And also please consider supporting us on patreon.com/The Father Leo Show. It's the only way that we can dish out faith, culture, and commentary. And to the Pope, ad multos annos. And as always for you and me, we have to stay hungry for God.